The small town of Clermont, nestled deep within the dense Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, was a place where time itself seemed to stand still. The town's pride lay in its rich coal mining history, which had once breathed life into the community. Now, decades later, most of the old mines and structures had been abandoned, their creaking skeletons left as silent witnesses to a bygone era. One of these forgotten relics was the First Mountain National Bank, a grand old building constructed in the 1920s. Its imposing stone walls and towering columns had once symbolized prosperity, but the bank had been shut down in the 1970s after a financial collapse. Since then, it had stood like a tomb, silent, sealed, and forgotten. A local legend had grown around the bank's vault, a massive steel chamber that had remained locked ever since the building's closure. Generations whispered tales of riches left behind, but no one dared to touch the vault. Some claimed it was cursed, while others simply dismissed it as an impenetrable relic. For years, the vault was ignored until a chance discovery changed everything. On a cold November morning, Maggie Turner, a 32-year-old history professor at a nearby college, arrived in Clermont with her 9-year-old son, Elliot, and her scruffy terrier mix, Teddy. Maggie had always been fascinated by the stories of the bank and decided to explore it as part of her research on local folklore. Her son, Elliot, tagged along with wide-eyed curiosity, clutching Teddy's leash as the excitable little dog sniffed around the overgrown lot. The building's interior was eerily intact, its musty corridors frozen in time. Dust motes floated in the dim light streaming through cracked windows. Maggie marveled at the ornate details, the Art Deco moldings, the tarnished chandeliers, and the faded murals that whispered of an era of grandeur. But what caught her attention was the vault. There it stood, at the end of a long corridor, its enormous steel door gleaming even after decades of neglect. Intrigued, Maggie approached, running her fingers over the cold surface. She wasn't the first to wonder what lay beyond that door, but her curiosity burned brighter than most. Elliot, meanwhile, tugged at Teddy's leash as the little dog began barking furiously. His tiny paws scratched at the ground near the base of the vault. "What's gotten into him?" Elliot asked, his voice a mix of amusement and concern. Teddy was usually calm, but now he seemed frantic, pawing and barking at the vault like his life depended on it. Maggie laughed nervously. "Maybe he's just spooked. Let's not stay too long." But as they turned to leave, something stopped them in their tracks. A sound, faint at first but unmistakable. A low, mournful whine, like an animal crying out in pain, echoed from behind the steel door. Elliot froze, his eyes wide. "Mom, did you hear that?" Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She leaned in closer, pressing her ear to the cool metal. The sound came again, closer this time. A weak, pitiful whimper, followed by a scratch as if something or someone was trying to escape. "Impossible," she muttered under her breath. The vault had been sealed for nearly 50 years. There couldn't be anything alive inside, could there? Determined to solve the mystery, Maggie contacted the local historical society, who in turn called a locksmith skilled in dealing with antique safes. A small crowd of curious townsfolk gathered as the locksmith, a grizzled man named Walter Grayson, worked on the vault. Hours passed as he drilled, tinkered, and muttered under his breath. Finally, with a deafening clunk, the lock gave way and the heavy door creaked open. What they found inside left everyone speechless. Amidst the cobweb darkness of the vault, a pair of glowing amber eyes stared back at them. There, lying on the cold, dusty floor, was a dog. Its fur, a matted and unkempt mix of brown and black, clung to its frail frame. The animal looked ancient, its body gaunt and trembling as it struggled to stand. Yet, against all odds, it was alive. How is this even possible?" Walter stammered, stepping back in disbelief. The dog let out a weak bark, its voice hoarse from years of silence. It stumbled forward, its eyes filled with a mixture of fear, relief, and hope. Maggie's heart broke as she knelt down, extending her hand cautiously. The dog sniffed her fingers, then nuzzled into her palm with a shuddering sigh, as if it had finally found safety after years of unimaginable loneliness. Elliot, clutching Teddy tightly, whispered, "Mom, he's been in there all this time?" Maggie didn't know what to say. No one did. The crowd stood in stunned silence, grappling with the impossibility of what they were witnessing. How had this dog survived in a sealed vault for nearly 5 decades? What had it endured during those years of isolation? As the dog collapsed into Maggie's arms, exhausted but alive, she made a silent vow. She would uncover its story, no matter how incredible or heartbreaking it turned out to be. Little did she know, the journey to understand this miraculous creature would change all of their lives forever. The discovery of the dog, which Elliot quickly nicknamed Vault, sent shockwaves through Clermont. By the next morning, the small town was buzzing with rumors and speculation. Everyone had their own theory. Some believed Vault was a ghost or a supernatural being, while others were convinced it was part of an elaborate hoax. But Maggie, cradling the trembling, emaciated dog in her arms, knew one thing for certain. This creature had endured something extraordinary. And it was her responsibility to ensure that Vault survived whatever remained of his miraculous life. The first challenge was medical care. Maggie rushed Vault to Dr. Grace Hensley, the local veterinarian, whose clinic was little more than a converted garage on the edge of town. Dr. Hensley was a kind, middle-aged woman with a reputation for handling even the most hopeless cases, but when she laid eyes on Vault, her confidence wavered. "This dog," she whispered, running her hands over Vault's frail body. "Maggie, I don't know how he's even alive. His muscle mass is almost non-existent, and his organs." She paused, glancing at Maggie with a mix of astonishment and worry. "I'll do everything I can, but he's in critical condition. Whatever he's been through, it's a miracle he lasted this long." Dr. Hensley hooked Vault up to an IV for fluids and began running tests. As she worked, Maggie and Elliot sat in the waiting room, their nerves fraying with every passing second. Teddy, who had been unusually subdued since the discovery, sat quietly at Elliot's feet, his head resting on his paws. Even he seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. After hours of waiting, Dr. Hensley finally emerged, her face etched with exhaustion. "He's stable for now," she said, "but I need to ask you something. Did you see anything in the vault? Food, water, anything that could explain how he survived?" Maggie shook her head. "Nothing. The vault was completely empty." Dr. Hensley frowned. "Then we're dealing with something I can't explain. Vault is malnourished, yes, but he doesn't show signs of dehydration or starvation the way he should. It's as if his body adapted somehow, slowed down its processes to survive." Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. "You mean, like hibernation?" Dr. Hensley nodded slowly. "That's the closest comparison I can make, but dogs don't hibernate. This defies everything we know about biology." Despite the mystery surrounding Vault's survival, the more pressing concern was his recovery. Maggie decided to bring him home, knowing the sterile environment of the vet clinic couldn't compare to the comfort of a loving household. Vault was too weak to walk, so Maggie and Elliot carried him into their modest home, setting up a soft bed in the living room. Teddy, curious but cautious, sniffed at the newcomer before curling up nearby, as if sensing Vault needed a companion. As the days passed, Vault began to regain his strength. Maggie fed him small, frequent meals, boiled chicken, rice, and broth, and monitored his every move. Elliot took it upon himself to keep Vault company, reading books aloud to him, and even playing soft music to help him relax. Vault, despite his frailty, seemed to trust them completely. His amber eyes followed Maggie and Elliot everywhere, a quiet gratitude shining through the pain. But Vault's presence also brought questions that refused to be ignored. Maggie couldn't stop wondering how he had ended up in the vault in the first place. The building had been abandoned for decades, with no record of anyone accessing it since its closure. And yet, Vault was there, a living, breathing anomaly. Determined to find answers, Maggie delved into the bank's history, poring over old records at the local library. She discovered that the bank had been a hub of activity in the 1930s, particularly during the Great Depression. Desperate families had stored their valuables in the vault, hoping to safeguard their futures. But the records also hinted at something darker, a string of thefts, a missing employee, and whispers of foul play that were never fully resolved. One name kept appearing in the archives: Joseph "Joe" Calloway, a night watchman who had disappeared in 1939. Just months before the vault was permanently sealed. Joe was described as a quiet man, fiercely loyal to his dog, a German Shepherd mix named Shep. The two were inseparable, and Joe often brought Shep to work during his overnight shifts. The last record of Joe was a witness statement from a coworker who claimed he saw Joe entering the vault with Shep late one night and never coming out. Maggie's heart raced as she pieced the story together. Could Vault be Shep? The timeline didn't make sense. No dog could live that long. And yet, the resemblance was uncanny. The archives described Shep as having striking amber eyes and a distinctive patch of black fur on his chest, features that matched Vault exactly. The more Maggie learned, the more questions arose. Was it possible that Vault was somehow connected to Joe Calloway's disappearance? And if so, how had he survived for all these decades? The weight of the mystery pressed down on her, but she knew she couldn't stop now. Meanwhile, Vault's recovery hit a roadblock. Despite his progress, he began showing signs of deep emotional distress, whining in his sleep, pacing restlessly, and staring at the front door as if waiting for someone to return. Dr. Hensley suggested it might be trauma, a response to years of isolation, but Maggie suspected there was more to it. One night, as she sat by Vault's side, she noticed him pawing at the floor, his claws scraping against the wooden planks. At first, she thought it was just a nervous habit, but then she realized he was trying to dig. Intrigued, she placed a piece of paper and a pen on the floor in front of him, just to see what he would do. To her astonishment, Vault nudged the pen with his nose, moving it in small, deliberate strokes. When he stopped, Maggie picked up the paper and gasped. It wasn't much, just a shaky, crude shape, but it was unmistakable. A star. Maggie stared at the crude drawing of a star, her mind racing. Was Vault trying to communicate? The possibility seemed absurd, but after everything that had happened, she was willing to consider even the most unlikely explanations. She showed the drawing to Elliot, whose eyes widened in excitement. "Mom, maybe Vault is trying to tell us something about Joe Calloway," Elliot exclaimed. "Remember, you said he disappeared with his dog and Vault might be Shep." Maggie hesitated. "Elliot, Shep would be over 90 years old by now. Dogs don't live that long." "But Vault isn't a normal dog," Elliot insisted. "He survived in a sealed vault for decades. Maybe time works differently for him." Maggie couldn't deny that Vault was extraordinary. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, she decided to revisit the old bank, this time with a new purpose. The next morning, Maggie, Elliot, and Vault returned to the First Mountain National Bank. Vault seemed anxious but resolute, pulling gently on the leash as if he knew exactly where he wanted to go. They entered the building, its shadowy interior feeling less ominous and more like a gateway to answers. Vault led them straight to the vault room. The massive steel door stood ajar from their previous visit, revealing the dark chamber within. Vault hesitated at the entrance, then stepped inside. Maggie and Elliot followed, their footsteps echoing in the hollow space. Inside, Vault began sniffing the walls, finally stopping at a spot where the stone met the metal framework. He started pawing at a loose brick, whimpering softly. Maggie crouched down and examined the area. With a bit of effort, she managed to dislodge the brick, revealing a small compartment behind it. Inside the hidden niche was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn and pages yellowed with age. Maggie carefully pulled it out, her hands trembling. The name Joseph Calloway was etched on the first page. "Mom, it's Joe's journal," Elliot whispered, his voice filled with awe. They retreated from the vault to the lobby, where the light was better. Maggie opened the journal, and together they began to read Joe's final entries. April 5th, 1939. I don't have much time. They've discovered my plan to expose the embezzlement. I fear for my life, but I can't let them get away with ruining so many families. Shep is with me, as always. If anything happens, I pray someone finds this journal. April 6th, 1939. They're coming for me. I've locked myself and Shep in the vault. They think they've trapped me, but I have enough provisions to last a while. I hope it's enough time to figure out a way to get this evidence to the authorities. April 15th, 1939. It's been over a week. No one has come. Food is running low. Shep is restless. If anyone finds this, please know that I tried to do the right thing. April 20th, 1939. Shep has been acting strange. Last night his eyes seemed to glow in the dark, and he stood guard at the door, as if sensing something I couldn't see. I feel weak, but he seems stronger than ever. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me. April 25th, 1939. I don't understand what's happening. Shep hasn't needed food or water for days. He seems different. It's as if time doesn't affect him the same way anymore. I can barely keep my eyes open. If this is the end, at least I'm not alone. The entries ended there. Maggie closed the journal, her eyes misty. Joe must have perished in the vault, she said softly. But how did Shep Vault survive all this time? Elliot pondered for a moment. Maybe when Joe died, something happened that changed Vault, like a protective spirit or, I don't know, magic? Maggie smiled sadly. I wish I had an explanation, but sometimes things happen that science can't explain. As they left the bank, Vault paused at the entrance, turning back one last time before following them outside. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the town. Maggie decided it was time to give Joe and his loyal companion the recognition they deserved. Over the next few days, Maggie organized a memorial for Joseph Calloway. She contacted the local newspaper, sharing the story of Joe's bravery and the mysterious survival of Vault. The town was captivated, and soon, a movement began to honor forgotten heroes like Joe. During the memorial service held on the steps of the old bank, townspeople gathered to pay their respects. Maggie spoke about Joe's courage in standing up against corruption, and how his loyalty was mirrored by his dog, who had somehow endured decades to bring his story to light. Vault sat beside her, his amber eyes reflecting the candlelight as if understanding the significance of the moment. When the service concluded, Vault let out a single, clear bark, a sound that echoed with both sorrow and relief. That night, back at home, Vault seemed more at peace. He ate heartily, played gently with Teddy, and even wagged his tail, a sight that filled Maggie and Elliot with joy. As they settled in for the evening, Maggie felt a sense of closure. Perhaps Vault had fulfilled his purpose in revealing Joe's story. But the following morning, Vault didn't wake up. Maggie found him lying peacefully in his bed, a serene expression on his face. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized that his incredible journey had come to an end. Elliot hugged Teddy tightly, both of them mourning the loss of their extraordinary friend. They decided to bury Vault under the old oak tree in their backyard, a place where he had loved to rest and watch the world go by. As they laid him to rest, Maggie noticed something glinting in the soil. She reached down and pulled out a tarnished silver locket. Opening it, she found a faded photograph of Joe and Shep, both smiling broadly. On the opposite side was engraved a simple inscription, "Loyalty beyond time." Maggie gasped. "Elliot, look, it's Joe and Shep." Elliot's eyes widened. "It's like Vault wanted us to find this." They hung the locket on a low branch of the oak tree, a tribute to a bond that transcended time. In the days following Vault's peaceful passing, Maggie and Elliot found themselves reflecting on the extraordinary story that had unfolded before them. But there was still an unanswered question that lingered in Maggie's heart. What exactly had happened in that vault, and how had Vault survived those decades alone? The journal had shed some light on Joe's final days, but it was incomplete. There was something deeper at play, something Maggie felt compelled to uncover. Vault's story had touched the town deeply, and soon after the memorial, Maggie was approached by a historian from the Smithsonian Institution, Dr. Evelyn March, who had read about the miraculous dog in the local newspaper. Dr. March was a specialist in unsolved historical mysteries and had a reputation for tackling even the strangest of phenomena with an open mind. "I'm not here to discredit what happened," Dr. March said gently when she met Maggie and Elliot in their home. "In fact, I think Vault's story could be one of the most remarkable cases of loyalty and survival ever recorded. But I'd like to examine the vault itself and the surrounding circumstances. Maybe together, we can find some answers." Elliot, clutching the silver locket they'd found near Vault's grave, nodded eagerly. "Vault was special. I think he deserves to have his story told." The next day, Dr. March accompanied Maggie, Elliot, and a small team of scientists and preservationists back to the First Mountain National Bank. Vault's presence still seemed to linger in the air, as if the old building remembered him. The group set up equipment in the vault room, scanning for hidden compartments, testing the air quality, and taking samples of the materials. What they found was nothing short of astonishing. Using advanced scanning technology, Dr. March's team discovered faint traces of a rare mineral embedded in the walls of the vault, a crystalline substance known as fluorite with anomalous isotopes, which had unique electromagnetic properties. Though the mineral was harmless to humans, Its energy signature was highly unusual and poorly understood. "This mineral is fascinating," Dr. March explained, holding up a glowing shard she'd carefully extracted. "In certain conditions, it could theoretically create a kind of stasis effect, slowing biological processes to an extreme degree. It's just a hypothesis, but maybe Vault's prolonged survival was due to prolonged exposure to this substance. It could have altered his metabolism, putting him in a near hibernation state." Maggie was skeptical, but intrigued. "Are you saying the vault itself kept him alive?" Dr. March nodded thoughtfully. "It's possible, but what's even more remarkable is Vault's loyalty. If he was Shep, Joe's dog, he stayed alive, waiting because of his bond with his owner. Animals don't understand time the way we do, but they understand love and loyalty. Maybe that was his anchor." Elliot's eyes shone with wonder. "He waited for Joe, even after all those years." Dr. March smiled at him. "Sometimes love can defy the very laws of nature." The discovery of the mineral drew attention from scientists across the country, but Maggie insisted that Vault's story remain the focus. She worked closely with Dr. March to ensure the narrative honored both Vault and Joe's sacrifice. Together, they compiled a comprehensive account of the events, which was published in several national outlets. The article became a sensation, drawing thousands of people to Clermont to see the vault, the journal, and the silver locket for themselves. But even as Vault's story gained recognition, Maggie noticed something else happening. The town of Clermont began to heal. For decades, it had been a place of stagnation, haunted by its fading history. But Vault's story reminded the townspeople of their resilience and capacity for renewal. The community began restoring other abandoned buildings, creating new opportunities for tourism and commerce. The once forgotten town was now thriving, and it all started with a dog who refused to give up. Maggie, however, wasn't quite ready to let go of Vault. One quiet afternoon, she and Elliot visited his grave beneath the old oak tree. The locket they had found now hung on the lowest branch, swaying gently in the winter breeze. Maggie knelt by the mound of earth, placing a small bouquet of wildflowers at its base. "Vault," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You've done more than anyone could have imagined. You brought us together. You reminded us what love and loyalty look like. And because of you, Joe's story will never be forgotten." Elliot crouched beside her, his hand resting on the locket. "Do you think Vault is with Joe now?" Maggie smiled through her tears. "I'd like to think so. Maybe they're walking together somewhere beyond time." That night, Maggie dreamed of Vault. In her dream, he was young and strong, his coat gleaming and his amber eyes bright. He stood beside a man she instantly recognized from the photograph in the locket, Joe Calloway. The two of them were surrounded by a golden light, and as Maggie watched, Vault turned to her and wagged his tail before walking away with Joe into the horizon. She woke with tears on her cheeks, but a deep sense of peace in her heart. Vault had completed his journey, and now it was time for Maggie and Elliot to carry forward his legacy. In the weeks that followed, Maggie helped organize a community event to dedicate the newly restored bank as a heritage and learning center. The main exhibit was Vault's story, complete with Joe's journal, the locket, and a display about the mysterious mineral that had seemingly preserved Vault's life. At the heart of the exhibit was a bronze statue of Vault and Joe, standing side by side, their bond immortalized in metal. Elliot stood proudly beside his mother as the statue was unveiled, his hand resting on Teddy's head. "Mom," he said quietly, "do you think Vault would be proud of us?" Maggie placed her arm around him. "I think he'd be proud of all of us, and I think he'd want us to keep telling his story." The statue became a symbol not just of Vault's incredible journey, but of the power of loyalty, love, and the connections that transcend time. Visitors from around the world came to Clermont to learn about the miraculous dog and his owner, and many left feeling inspired to cherish the bonds in their own lives. For Maggie and Elliot, life slowly returned to normal, but they carried Vault's memory with them in everything they did. Maggie continued her work as a history professor, using Vault's story to teach her students about courage and perseverance. Elliot, inspired by the adventure, started writing a children's book about a dog who defied time to save his owner. And Teddy, ever the loyal companion, stayed close to Elliot's side, as if honoring Vault's legacy in his own quiet way. As time passed, Valt's story remained an indelible part of Maggie and Elliot's lives. Though the miraculous dog was gone, his presence lingered in ways that were both subtle and profound. On quiet evenings, Maggie often found herself sitting beneath the old oak tree in their backyard, her eyes fixed on the silver locket swaying in the breeze. She would think about Valt and Joe, about the courage it must have taken for both man and dog to endure those lonely final days in the vault, and about the love that had somehow bridged decades to bring their story to light. For Elliot, the experience had left an even deeper mark. Valt's unwavering loyalty had taught him that love, true, unconditional love, was not bound by time, distance, or even death. Inspired by the journey they had shared, Elliot finished his children's book, which he titled Valt, the Dog Who Waited. The book was published a year later, its heartfelt illustrations and simple yet powerful message touching readers around the world. It became a bestseller, and Maggie couldn't have been prouder of her son. Claremont, too, continued to thrive. The Heritage and Learning Center brought a steady stream of visitors to the small Appalachian town, revitalizing its economy and uniting its community. Valt's story became a symbol of resilience, a testament to the idea that even the most forgotten places and people could find new life and purpose. The bronze statue of Valt and Joe stood proudly in the town square, a constant reminder of the bonds that define us, even in the face of the unexplainable. Yet for Maggie, Valt's greatest legacy wasn't in the headlines, the museum exhibits, or even the children's book. It was in the quiet moments when she saw the way Valt's story had changed her son. Elliot had grown kinder, more patient, and more deeply attuned to the world around him. He had learned to cherish life's small miracles, to appreciate the fleeting moments of connection that made life meaningful. One evening, as the two of them sat beneath the oak tree, Elliot asked a question that had been on his mind for a long time. "Do you think Valt waited all those years just so we could find him, Mom?" Maggie looked at her son, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the setting sun. "I think Valt waited because that's what love does," she said gently. "It holds on, even when it seems impossible. And maybe he was waiting for us, not just to tell his story, but to remind us how important it is to hold on to the people and things we love." Elliot smiled, his gaze drifting up to the locket swaying on the branch. "Then I think he did exactly what he was meant to do." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Maggie felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Valt's journey had been extraordinary, filled with mystery and heartache, but also with hope and love. It was a story that would continue to inspire for generations, a reminder that even in the darkest of places, loyalty and love could light the way. And though Valt was gone, Maggie liked to believe that somewhere, beyond the confines of time and space, a dog with glowing amber eyes was finally at rest, walking side by side with the man he had loved so fiercely. Together, they were home.